Christian Church Disciples of Christ grew out of two movements seeking Christian unity that sprang up almost simultaneously in western Pennsylvania and Kentucky. Movements that were backlashes against the rigid denominationalism of the early 1800s. Thomas and Alexander Campbell, a Presbyterian Scottish-Irish immigrant father and son in Pennsylvania, rebelled against the dogmatic sectarianism that kept members of different denominations, and even factions within the same denomination, from partaking of the Lord's Supper together. Christians, the name adopted by Stone's movement, represented what he felt to be a shedding of denominational labels in favor of a scriptural and inclusive term. Campbell had similar reasons for settling on Disciples of Christ, but he felt the term disciples less presumptuous than Christians. The aims and practices of the two groups were similar, and the Campbell and Stone movements united in 1832 in Lexington, Kentucky, after about a quarter of a century of separate development. The history of disciples, like much of our national history, is absent references to women and their involvement in our denomination's development for more than 40 years of our early history. The women's rights movement of 1848 laid the groundwork. The 1861 Women's Union Missionary Society movement gained widespread endorsement for the Great Awakening among women. While the church was evolving, the country was also in the midst of a civil war that undoubtedly affected the church as well as society. During these early years, women did not have the right to vote, and they certainly were not seen as able to take on most leadership roles, including church leadership. However, during the Civil War, many women were heavily involved in raising and distributing aid to the soldiers. As they did this work, they discovered skills, abilities, and power that neither they nor the rest of the nation recognized. They had first-hand knowledge of the many things they were indeed capable of. Women were gaining wider acceptance in formal education institutions and were drawn to areas of service, teaching, medicine, and those required in missionary services. In 1873, the anti-saloon campaign and the founding of the Women's Christian Temperance Union included many disciples women. Carrie Nation gained notoriety by her fierce aggression toward saloons, an aggression based on her childhood memories of a drunken, abusive father and a first husband who also had a drinking problem. Her second husband, David Nation, became pastor of Christian Church in Medicine Lodge, Kansas. It was at this time that Carrie Nation attempted to shut down the illegal but flourishing alcohol industry in Kansas by passive resistance, praying outside the saloon doors. Appeals to law enforcement also failed, so she tried more aggressive tactics. She became known throughout the Midwest for her hatchet-swinging destruction of bars and saloons, which of course landed her in jail many times. In stark contrast, another disciples woman, Zerelda Wallace, whose passion for reform of alcohol abuses was equal to Carrie's, found expression in a different way. She was so opposed to alcohol that she refused for several weeks to take the communion cup. She rose from her seat one Sunday and gave her reasons for declining the wine in a short speech, which was the death knell to the use of spirituous liquors in churches. In due time, she was recognized as the foremost woman orator of Indiana, and continued to speak out against the evils of alcohol, as well as for the advantages of giving women the right to vote. As disciples women, we still often do not agree on the how of the ministry, but bound as a general unit, we are committed to love and justice for all God's children. This unity makes us stronger. Carolyn Neville Paris, an educator and wife of a minister, taught at Christian colleges in Missouri, Kentucky, and Ohio. The Easter of 1874, when she was about to turn 43, she was particularly moved by the especially meaningful Easter service. As her husband preached about the redemptive grace of God, aimed at drawing all of humanity into a new relationship with the risen Christ, incredible joy swept over her at the renewed recognition that the gift of the grace of God is for everyone. She had already been concerned about the lack of work being done to share the good news both at home and around the world. The American Christian Missionary Society, under the leadership of Alexander Campbell, had existed for 25 years and had been doing work in 3 areas overseas. However, it had not been able to secure enough funds to continue the work. This weighed heavily on her, and she was convicted that the church needed to find a way to be and share the good news. That Friday after Easter, in April of 1874, she sat down in her favorite chair, for her daily Bible reading and prayer with all of this on her heart. As she sat there in her devotions, it came to her that she should become involved in organizing the women of the church to do this work. She immediately began to lay the groundwork for what would later become a $1.5 million enterprise, organized and managed exclusively by women. Both men and women became missionaries doing mission work, including educational, benevolent, medical, industrial, and directly evangelistic. This was unique in that all business of the organization was managed by women, who collected and dispersed the funds, and employed and directed our missionaries. This was the first organization of women doing home mission work. Disciples women have amazing strengths in organizing and relationship building, which is a hallmark of their faith. Mrs. Paris wrote letters to many leaders in the church and began strategic planning to organize to achieve what God was calling them to do. She wrote to women in 6 different states she had chosen very carefully. Mrs. O.A. Burgess, who is married to the president of Northwestern Christian University, which later became Butler College, who was formerly the pastor of Central Christian Church in Indianapolis. She was later elected national treasurer of the CWBM and later became vice president, then president. Mrs. Enos Campbell was married to the pastor of First Christian Church in Jacksonville, Illinois. She and her husband had worked long and hard in promoting the cause of missions. Mrs. B.F. Coleman endorsed the plan and began to direct energies towards its passage. A great barrier of conservatism in Kentucky made it necessary for the women to move more slowly toward organized work than their sisters. Mrs. Coleman was chosen as corresponding secretary for the newly formed Women's Kentucky Christian Missionary Society when it was organized in 1875. All the funds were used to educate young men for Christian ministry. This position enabled her to keep directly in touch with the leaders of the general organized work. Mrs. Joseph King, Charlotte McGrew King, was deeply involved in the missionary efforts of First Christian Church in Allegheny, Pennsylvania, where her husband was a 21-year pastor. She became a charter member of CWBM and devoted herself to organizing mostly children's missionary groups throughout the Eastern Seaboard. When CWBM added a young people's department in 1884, she was chosen as the first national superintendent. Mrs. L.S. Major from Chicago, whose husband was a well-known doctor, sent an immediate and enthusiastic response. She was present in Cincinnati at the organizing meeting of the women. She was later elected to serve on the first board of managers for CWBM. Mrs. J.K. Rogers was a student at Christian College in Columbia, Missouri. Receiving the letter helped launch the move toward missions among the disciples of Christ. She became a charter member of CWBM, whose message had been rapidly and forcefully disseminated to homes and churches in every state and territory where Christian churches were located. Mrs. R.R. Sloan, wife of a Cleveland minister, responded with strong approval of Caroline's plan. She was chosen to preside at the women's meeting that took place Wednesday, October 21, 1874. Mrs. R.M. Bishop was the only one who didn't respond immediately due to circumstances in her life. Later in the summer, she and her husband gave their full endorsement. By the time the arrangements for the 1874 General Convention were completed, women across several states had met in local groups, affirmed the call to organize missionary societies, and had begun to collect offerings for spreading the good news, even though there was not yet a national treasury or even a stated enterprise to move the work forward. When the convention met, 75 women from 9 different states met in the basement of the church to listen to Mrs. Paris make a statement regarding the purpose of the meeting. Mrs. Paris later addressed the convention of men, defying tradition and urging support for foreign missions. In October of that year, they had their first organizing meeting of the Christian Women's Board of Missions. They made no distinction between home and foreign missions. Their field was the world. The Board of Missions provided training programs that equipped thousands of young people and established 4 Bible chairs at state universities. In 1876, CWBM sent their first missionary to Jamaica. This did not mean that it was smooth sailing. Many voices were raised in opposition when the news was received in congregations, resulting in sermons, letters, and stands against this new freedom for women. An organization organized and operated solely by women was beyond acceptance by those who firmly believed a woman's place was in the home, period. By the end of the Civil War, a groundswell of activities on all fronts was evident among women, and an uneasiness crept across the male-dominated systems and institutions. In 1882, missionaries were sent to Bombay, India by CWBM. Mary Graybeale, Ada Boyd, Mary Kingsbury, and Laura Kinsey. In 1885, they opened a Bible school for children, then a weekday school, then visitation with women in their homes. The first women doctors were sent by CWBM, Dr. Olivia Baldwin and Dr. Arabella Merrill. In 1883, resources became available to publish a resource planned since the first organizational meeting, Missionary Tidings. In 1886, another group of women in St. Louis, recognizing a need to assist poor and orphan children, and led by Mattie Yunkin, began what is now the National Benevolent Association, the social services ministry of the church. Efforts to minister to orphans had been made in several states prior to the Civil War, but without lasting success. Organized benevolence grew slowly among disciples, perhaps due to the anti-institutionalism preached by early disciples' leaders. The NBA was established in 1887. Again, relationship building and organization show forth as hallmarks of faith. In 1889, Clara Babcock was ordained. She was also one of the leaders in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Following a speaking engagement representing the WCTU, the congregation urged her to become their minister. She participated in 28 annual revivals and served as pastor at churches in Illinois, Iowa, and North Dakota. In 1892, Sarah Lou Bostick became one of the first African American women to be ordained in the Disciples' Church. She was born in 1868 and was one of 10 children, largely self-educated and fiercely independent. She organized at least 6 women's societies in Arkansas. She was appointed state organizer among the black congregations in Arkansas in 1902. Her great vision for educational opportunities for her black brothers and sisters led to her invitation to organize missionary societies in Texas. Mrs. Bostick became the national president of the Negro CWBM. She was a pioneer in black and white women joining efforts to move their mission goals forward. Jarvis Christian College is the only missionary institution established by CWBM for the training of African Americans that is still in existence. Her commitment to relationships and organization strengthened her work. In 1895, Nancy E. Atkinson, one of the women who worked to begin the Board of Missions, and her husband received news of the death of a pastor who left behind a nearly blind widow and several children with no means of support. This news resulted in Mr. Atkinson establishing a fund to provide support for his family and was the beginning of the pension fund. In the early 1900s, CWBM was the first of the National Disciples Boards to reach out to people of Spanish, Mexican, and Puerto Rican descent. Mission stations serving Hispanic communities were begun in several locations along the Texas-Mexico border, but one still in full operation is the Inman Christian Center in San Antonio. One of the hallmarks of faith of Disciples Women is inclusion of all diversity. The College of Missions was established and the Missions Building was started between 1908 and 1910. In 1913, Canada became part of CWBM. Also in that year, the Board of Missions joined with interdenominational partner churches to provide the first college for women in central China, Jilin College. 2012 Women to Women Worldwide Journey visited the college and heard the story of mission. In 1919, the United Christian Missionary Society was formed and began its new life in 1920. 53% of the assets came from the CWBM, $1.4 million, as well as a well-defined network of 26 states and more than 4,100 local auxiliary organizations, a mailing list of 60,000 subscribers of its magazines, and mission stations on 4 continents. While it was a momentous time, it was not a happy one, with women turning all this over to male leadership and giving up the autonomy they had had for 45 years. The UCMS was a merging of the CWBM and the Foreign Christian Missionary Society, with the hope that shared leadership would be part of the partnership, which was not realized until 1971. In the 100 years since the UCMS was formed, there has been a century of amazing work. Celebrating the Golden Jubilee in 1924, an extra $1 million was raised for mission. Mission and ministry continue to be a hallmark of Disciples Women faith. In 1937, while Minnie Vautrin, a Disciples woman from Illinois, was serving the Jinling College previously established by CWBM and their partners, the Japanese mounted an invasion of China, referred to as the Nanking Massacre. Nanjing was previously named Nanking. The Japanese troops killed remnant Chinese soldiers in violation of the laws of war, murdered Chinese civilians, raped Chinese women, and destroyed or stole Chinese property on a scale that will never be known. The violence and destruction were extensive, with the number dead estimated at 300,000. Minnie was an educator, missionary, and the president of Jinling College, and had served in China for 28 years. She prepared intensely for the approaching army, making arrangements to prepare the campus by sending records to Shanghai, purchasing supplies, instructing students and faculty on emergency precautions, cleaning out and converting rooms in campus building for storage and refuge, and ordering the building of trenches. She provided care and protection for as many as 10,000 Chinese refugees during the massacre, at times even challenging the Japanese authorities for documents in an attempt to protect the civilians staying at her college. The American embassy encouraged Americans to evacuate, but Minnie could not leave the women and girls who depended on her. At times, she harbored up to 10,000 women in buildings designed to support between 200 and 300. She wrote frequently in her diary, including prayers and reflections. When all the other refugee camps closed in 1938, a large number of women and children again sought refuge at the college. Vautrin would patrol the campus grounds and repel incursions of Japanese soldiers into the college and rescue and care for the refugees. She saw to the burial of the dead and the reception of newborn babies, and was successful in tracing missing husbands and sons. Industrial or crafts classes were provided for women who had lost their husbands so they might be able to support themselves. 100 women graduated under that program. She had to go to the Japanese embassy repeatedly to get proclamations to prohibit Japanese soldiers from committing crimes at Jinling, because the soldiers tore the documents up before taking women away. She became known as the American Goddess at the Rape of Nanking, based on her selfless acts to save thousands of lives of Chinese women and girls. She was posthumously awarded the emblem of the Blue Jade by the Chinese government. Supporting and standing in solidarity with other women is a hallmark of Disciples Women faith. In 1949, a great deal of organizing began, establishing the Christian Women's Fellowship, followed by the Department of Christian Women's Fellowship and UCMS in 1952. The next year, the International Christian Women's Fellowship was formed, as well as the ICWF Commission and Advisory Council. 1953 was also the year the spiritual discipline of blessing boxes began. In 1955, the World Christian Women's Fellowship was established. In 1986, the Woman to Woman Worldwide program was designed to put North American women in personal contact with women in other countries, to provide opportunities to personalize mission in the life of congregations. The first journey was launched in 1989. This continues to be a healthy, life-giving, life-changing, and self-sustaining ministry. This journey builds relationships among the women in the delegation, as well as with their global sisters. When the women return, they share their experience and what they have learned, and encourage others to support the programs that Global Ministries has established with these partners. Disciples Women continues to build relationships in the global sisterhood. In 1989, Disciples Women began focusing on specific social action emphases, with domestic violence being the first. Also, the focus has been economic justice for women, racism, nurturing the girl child, and human trafficking, including the emphasis on the vulnerability of immigrants and refugees. In 1990, the Disciples Women's Endowment Fund was established to provide grants for new and creative ministries, by women and for women. In 1992, the Division of Homeland Ministries restructure included the creation of the Office of Disciples Women as part of the Center for Leadership and Ministry. In 1999, In the Fullness of Time was published detailing the history of Disciples Women, written by Fran Craddock, Martha Faw, and Nancy Heimer. In 2000, the Women's Action Web was designed to provide an opportunity for Disciples Women to come into personal contact with women and social agencies in a specific area of the United States and learn how to replicate those mission and advocacy programs in their own regions and communities. In 2009, the first issue of Just Women was published in a joint partnership between IDWM and Disciples World magazine. In 2010, IDWM assumed ownership and became publisher. That year, Volume 1 of Wisdom of Women was created in a DVD format featuring Reverend Nancy Heimer, a past staff member of the Department of Churchwomen. In 2013, Volume 2 with Melvia Fields was created. Both volumes are available on Disciples Women YouTube channel. 2010 was the year the Principles of Mutuality established Disciples Women's Ministries as a self-determining ministry in close covenant with DHM. 2011 marked the beginning of Disciples Women operating as a self-determining ministry. As part of this change, the executive director of Disciples Women became a general cabinet member, including General Assembly report and non-voting representation on the general board. This inclusion of women's voices in general leadership provided the opportunity for the majority of the church to be in leadership participation and offered the opportunity for the ministries of Disciples Women to build relationships with other general ministries, which resulted in a number of collaborations with those general ministry partners. In 2015, the IDWM Executive Committee commissioned Yewa Lee to create the Her Story Tree logo to illustrate connectedness, relationship, and diversity of Disciples Women. In 2019, the Her Story Continues Fund was established with the Christian Church Foundation to fund women's ministries into the future. This fund is invested in CCF's Sarah Lou Bostic Fund, which focuses on ethical companies not involved in weapons, fossil fuels, or perpetuating the Israeli-Palestine conflict. CCF has taken seriously the justice and social action focus of Disciples Women and works in collaboration toward the same goals. Lorraine Lawless suggests that three great chronological themes reveal the awesome story of women in the Disciples of Christ: the worldwide missionary enterprise, the plea for Christian unity, including sexual and cultural barriers and agencies of the denomination, and the search for women's place in church and society. Throughout the Disciples Women's history, they have been resilient because of their focus on mission, relationship building, organization, standing together with other women, breaking down barriers, collaboration, partnerships, and faithful prayer and worship. While women have long been the driving force of mission, outreach, and justice, they were not always included in the decision-making and goal-setting. Disciples Women was committed to reconciliation and anti-racism and was living into it even before the denomination turned its focus to that important goal. Women continue to be leaders in their congregations, and now their voice at the general level has given them the opportunity to educate others on the practices that make them resilient and unified, and to encourage others to work in collaboration to share with the world the grace and love of God.